Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the efforts that some in the food supply chain have been making again last week to warn of the serious health risks that we're facing because the government has still not implemented import controls for standards and has no plans to do so. Brexiteers talk about controlling our borders all the time, but they never say a word about the actual hold that we have in our trade border. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the food industry has been warning again about the problems of having no standards controls for food or similar products coming into the country. They say we could be in for a dose of African swine fever. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Top of everything else right now. Why not? Why not a disease ripping through our livestock? So it's worth quickly going over what needed to happen in order to actually secure our borders once we left the single market and customs union. As members of the single market, goods from outside were checked wherever they entered the market. This meant that all member states were effectively carrying out checks for one another. Now that we've left, we're totally responsible for all of our own. So if something's coming, say, from Asia, for example, and it happens to pass a port in the Netherlands first, they don't do anything. If it's bound for Britain, they just pass it on. Not out of spite, not out of laziness, because apart from anything else, they're trained in checking for EU customs and standards, not those of a third country. And there are two main types of import controls. You've got your customs, you've got your standards. Customs controls is essentially just about making sure that goods are declared so that any tariffs or other duties payable can be sorted. But of course, it's always possible that smugglers, who could be little tinkers, they'll falsify the documents. So you carry out a level of physical checks in order to make sure that what's on the box is what it says is on the documentation, to reduce the risk of smuggling. However, we're not able to carry out enough checks to reduce the risk without massively slowing down the flow of imports. So the government encouraged HMRC to basically prioritise freight flow over checks, and that's what they've done. That means smugglers have an easy time avoiding duties and our treasury is losing billions in revenue. But that's just a financial hit. If people are happy to keep paying high taxes to compensate for this Brexit problem, that is up to them. But standards checks are a much more serious problem. In theory, we do have customs controls. There is a process that people have to fill out. There's documentation you have to sort out. It's just that we don't apply the controls properly because we're not really checking that the documentation is a true reflection of what's in the box. But we have no standards controls at all. Standards controls are not about raising tax revenues, but about making sure that goods which cannot be lawfully sold in our market do not enter the country. When we left the EU, Michael Gove accepted that we would need about 50,000 agents in order to manage these customs and standards controls. Not feasible to hire and train that many people in such a short time, of course. Indeed, the government has gone very quiet on the issue, so we can only assume that they're not even attempting to. So not only are we not carrying out customs checks, we don't even have standards controls of any kind. We have laws, and people exporting to Britain should make sure that their goods they meet our standards, but we're not actually doing anything to enforce it. One thing we know is happening is that criminals around Europe are sending unsafe for consumption foodstuffs to Britain. We know this is taking place. There are no checks in the EU if the goods are going to be sold into the single... There are only checks in the EU if it's going to be sold in the EU single market. So if it's going to be sold somewhere else, EU authorities, well, it's not up to them. It's not up to them to apply someone else's standards. It's up to Britain what it allows to be sold in its market, not the EU. After all, you may have heard, we're a sovereign nation. We decide for ourselves. We know about the scale of the problem because a few months ago, British authorities decided to carry out a one-off exercise. Let's just have a look, lads, at just how bad the problem is. So over the course of a day, they checked 22 lorries. 21 of them had food that could not be legally sold. And we're not just talking about, oh, it's a bit past its sell-by date here. No. Maggot-infested, putrid, raw meats with dairy, all the Ramsay's kitchen nightmares in a lorry. It was that bad. If we carried out checks like this regularly, we would catch much more. And then we'd be able to do something to stop it. Because we could stop the suppliers responsible bringing goods in at all. Taking them to court could be tricky, arguably, because of our weak agreements with the EU. But we could at least stop them sending more. But we're not doing that. This exercise last October was a one-off. Our borders are literally wide open to any foodstuffs that exporters wish to send. We have no system in place to protect ourselves. And as industry experts are pointing out, we're essentially, well, we are particularly vulnerable because obviously not having any import control makes it easy for criminals to sell this stuff in Britain. But then factor in a couple of other things as well. So we're struggling to get enough food imports as it is. You sort of go around the supermarkets and go, well, there's food there. There is. But it's a lot more sparse than it used to be. And people maybe haven't noticed. But people are noticing when they go abroad on holiday to France or Poland or Belgium or anywhere else, they're going into the supermarkets and going, oh my God, there's food here. And then they come back home and then they see it. Actually, yeah, there's... What? We are struggling. We have food. We can get enough food. It's there. But we have shortages compared with what used to have. But also, we're facing a serious cost of living crisis. So the food that is available is like on average 15% more, 15% more expensive than it was a year ago. Then you've got an extra incentive for people to want to buy food more cheaply. They may not go to the supermarket. Oh, the fella down around the corner is selling this stuff really cheap. Well, if you can't afford to eat every day, you get that. So that is the incentive for criminals to send cheap, basically poisonous food in order to prey on those who cannot afford to eat properly. And all of this is because we are caught between a rock and a hard place. We cannot apply proper customs or standards controls with the staff and infrastructure we have available. And it would take an investment and a lot of time before we could. Right now, the government are not making any attempt to do so. It's not like Labour would just implement it quickly or easily when they come to power either, though. Because it would take too much investment, too much time to set up quickly. So if we try to protect our trade borders, it means lengthy delays, massively slowing down the flow of goods into the country. And for food and medicines, that's a big problem. We've already got shortages of food and we've already got shortages of medicines. You know, and we're now even more dependent on imports, especially for food, than we were before Brexit because our own production has gone down. This is a problem. It would mean much more serious shortages of both food and medicines. So serious that the public would actually notice it on a larger scale and the government could not in all seriousness survive. So the government have chosen to ignore the issue completely because as things stand, the problem is politically contained. You do hear people noticing that there seems to be problems getting supplies of certain medicines from the pharmacist, but there isn't like a national, oh my goodness, what's going on here? Same with food. So hardly anybody really knows about this and they certainly don't know what has caused it. The government do run the risk of a serious disease breaking out. And that would lead to reports letting people know, well, it's basically because the government have not been protecting us. But that is a risk as opposed to certain calamity if they let our shelves get really empty for an indefinite period of time. Besides, they will then attempt to muddy the waters. They'll go, oh, you things like happen in the single market. Don't you remember the horse meat scandal? Don't you remember this, that and the other? And yeah, these things do happen because you don't ever check everything. You cannot check everything. You check... Therefore, you can't reduce the risk to zero. But by not checking anything, we run a much higher risk than should be the case. It's all about managing risk. And this is another reason why no matter who wins the next election, we sort of know who it's going to be, but it really doesn't matter. The government that forms after that election will soon have to work on much closer alignment with the EU, no matter which party it is. Now, yes, it was a surprise hearing about the secret summit last week to discuss ways to work more closely with our European neighbours. But it was going to happen at some point. And for the Conservatives as much as Labour. The real hole in our border is not for small boats. We pick all of those up. All of them. Every single one. It's the lorry loads of unsafe and illegal goods entering our country and entering our market, which nobody is picking up. We know it's happening because when the authorities did spend a day just checking, just to see how bad the problem was, it was catastrophic with, as I say, 21 out of 22 lorries checked, carrying goods that then had to be seized because, my goodness, we cannot let people eat this. You know, those goods were stopped. But what about the lorries that passed through the previous day or the following day or every day since, when there are no checks? And criminal gangs around Europe, they know this. They know that we're a soft touch. We've got no checks. We're struggling for food. Millions are especially desperate for cheap food from, not the normal sources. They'll take whatever. It's a perfect storm. After the election, it's going to need to be dealt with. If it backfires badly, let's say it backfires badly shortly after the election, Labour will be able to blame the Tories, but they will still have to fix the issue. They can't just say, well, it's the Tories' fault, but we're still going to leave it. They will have to say what they're going to do to fix it. But they absolutely cannot afford to have it go wrong a few years later, because then the Tories will say, well, you've been in power for a few years. What have you been doing? And it won't matter that Labour say, well, what did you do? That won't matter. They'll have been in power for a few years. And that time in power will then be cut short. Brexit was sold on the lie that we could do without the world, or at least the bits of the world we'd like to cherry pick to do without. We can't. No man is an island entire of itself, but it turns out no island is an island either in this sense. If we cannot manage the necessary levels of trade while still maintaining acceptable levels of safety and security, then it's obvious we have to reduce the trade barriers until we can. And that is what is going to happen. It has to happen. The public may not be aware of this issue right now, which is the only reason the government are doing nothing about it. But the main parties are aware, and they know they cannot expect to continue to do nothing if something happens to draw the public's attention to it. In fact, they may actually suffer if something goes wrong anyway, but they will certainly not be able to do nothing about it when it happens. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.